What did the Senate majority fight for? One of the largest corporate bailouts with as few strings as possible in American history. Shameful. The greed.
New York is the global epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the Bronx and Queens have been called the epicenter of the epicenter. Now, Representative Ocasio-Cortez represents New York's 14th district, which lies within these boroughs. So this week, we wanted to ask how her constituents are coping and whether or not our national politics are meeting the challenge of the current crisis. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, thank you very much for taking the time today with us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Bronx and Queens are some of the hardest hit areas in this global pandemic. Maybe you could give us just a on the ground, what it looks like day to day in this hard hit area.
It's become so much of a new normal that I didn't realize almost how dramatically things had shifted until I went back to DC for a recent relief vote. And seeing the juxtapositions of these two worlds was just really jarring. Obviously, here in the Bronx and Queens, every single human being that goes outside has a mask under the state order. You know, we're talking about long lines going around the block 6 feet apart so that people can get groceries. We're talking about just sirens day in, day out, hour after hour. For me personally, it means having to call constituents. Just this morning, I had to call kids 12 and 13 years old who lost their mom. I'm constantly calling churches and mosques and synagogues of folks and congregations who have lost their faith leaders. This is not just about impacting families on a personal level, but our community leadership is also taking an enormous hit as well. And nurses are traumatized. You know, we're already hearing from frontline workers and hospital workers that they are kind of getting the oncoming symptoms of PTSD, or they're afraid of developing PTSD. It's just very, very heavy for all of us.
You represent one of the worst hit districts. What can we do, to mitigate this? And what are we doing to mitigate this?
Well, I think the challenge with this is that this doesn't just get fixed with some donations to a hospital or a charity. What we are seeing in the disparities here, the reason why the Bronx and Queens are so heavily hit, the reason why Black Americans are suffering from some of the highest mortality rates, immigrant communities, working class communities, is because coronavirus has just blown open systemic inequality that has been long simmering in the United States. And people have long been dying. The Bronx has had some of the highest asthma rates in the United States. East Elmhurst, a historically Black community, is in the shadow of LaGuardia Airport, where all of these gas fumes flow over these communities. And these are folks who aren't making a living wage, who have jobs that don't provide adequate healthcare, if they provide healthcare at all. And so this is why we're experiencing this. And so we are doing our best on the ground for short-term stuff. If people want to help, they need to support single-payer healthcare in the United States. We need to stand up and actually be comfortable talking about systemic and institutionalized racism in the United States. But so long as we're not ready for these conversations, we're not going to be able to address these issues.
What's the mood in Washington? It seems very, galvanized into partisanship. You have Mitch McConnell saying that, the blue state bailouts and let them go bankrupt. You have the president tweeting about let's hold money back from the states. What is the sort of feeling right now in Washington?
I cannot tell if the slow walking is just because a lot of these elected officials have not felt this impact yet. I don't know if it's because they're insulated and feel like this is not going to happen to them, that they're not going to get it, or they're not going to lose a loved one, or that their community will not be impacted. But there is an enormous lack of urgency around congressional leadership, I would say. You can tell a lot of these folks have not needed to scramble to pay rent in a long time. And, I still measure time by rent checks. And I think that we should legislate that way, which is what I said on the floor of the House.
It is a joke when Republicans say that they have urgency around this bill. The only folks that they have urgency around are folks like Ruth's Chris Steakhouse and Shake Shack. Those are the people getting assistance in this bill. If you had urgency, you would legislate like rent was due on May 1st and make sure that we include rent and mortgage relief for our constituents. Thank you very much.
We have passed 4 pieces of legislation. We still do not have adequate relief for rent and mortgages. We have a looming housing crisis that's ready to explode if we don't take action right now. That means mass displacement of people and risking mass displacement in the United States. You know, in terms of the partisanship, one of the things that I've kind of learned in working with Republicans is that they kind of see it as a sport. There's kind of a cultural difference, and it's not even necessarily a critique, but it's just a style that I've noticed. And when I went into town in the last relief bill that I voted against, because I just thought it was completely insufficient. I thought as Democrats we were getting had. And I had a Republican member walk up to me and said, "Why on earth are Democrats voting for this?" And he said, "You guys are getting totally fleeced. Why are you doing this?" And I basically said to him, "Why are you voting for this if you think this thing is so bad?" And he basically said, "Well, I got to vote my district. I got to kind of stick with my party." And I said, "Well, you know, there you have your answer." I saw a lot of people who either had reservations or didn't want to vote for this bill that voted for it. I had people tell me that they weren't going to vote for it, and then they did vote for it. You know, I think even in this crisis, it shows how strong that party fealty is.
When you look at it during the Obama administration, during the 2008 crisis, you know, it sort of wrecked Congress. It brought about the Tea Party. A lot was made during the Obama administration about, you know, the deficit, all of these concerns on the Republican side. Yet now we're passing stimulus bill after stimulus bill, as you mentioned, with no critique on both sides, yet both sides are saying, hey, these are exactly the same problems as the Obama administration. We're digging a fiscal hole, yet there's no dialogue about it. And you were, like you said, I believe the sole Democrat who voted against it. Why do you think that is?
I think there's a combination of things. One is that money in politics rules the day. These are bills that are overwhelmingly structured to benefit the wealthy, to benefit big business, to benefit industry. It actually became $4 trillion. We have never seen anything like that in our lifetimes or perhaps in American history. It was almost passed by unanimous consent entirely. You know, I think so there's a combination of things. So one, it's just the natural structure of power that continues to grow in the United States. It's kind of this creeping oligarchy that is continuing to grow. The other thing is just, again, it's the power of that party fealty. When I first got to Congress just last year, I thought it was almost like a national scandal, the way that we passed legislation. You just look at this $4 trillion bill. It was negotiated entirely in secret. We did not know developments. Even members of Congress did not really get very tangible updates, day-to-day updates on the negotiations. This was just literally a couple people in a room then coming out and saying, no, we can't change any of it. This is the best we got. Take it or leave it. And so you're literally talking about maybe 4 people and their teams writing a bill and then forcing the other 500 or so members, when you include the Senate, to vote on it up or down.
Who are those 4 people?
So it's Mitch McConnell, it's Chuck Schumer, it's Steven Mnuchin. You kind of had Nancy Pelosi, but honestly, since it was negotiated more in the Senate, she wasn't so much as part of those negotiations in that first round. The part that was so shocking is that we were in town for days waiting. We were hearing that a vote was going to be called any minute for about 48 hours. The vote was finally called at around 1 o'clock in the morning. And the reason it was taking so long was because House Republicans were waiting for Donald Trump to tweet his support for this initial bill. So that's how much of a lock there is on these things. There's an enormous amount of pressure not to break. Being a lone vote on any bill is one of the most difficult things you have to do as a member of Congress, because when you break with leadership, particularly if you rely on large donors, leadership kind of has like a spigot, right? And they have the amount of people in this country that can just cut a check for over $5,000 at the drop of a hat is much more finite. It's a specific class of people, and that class can be tight knit, and so which means it's more easily able to be kind of controlled.
So if you don't vote the party, they can cut off your money.
Yeah, that is definitely a huge incentive.
You've said recently, no, and I quote, "No, we are not going back to that."
We're not going back to working 70-hour weeks just so that we could put food on the table and not even feel any sort of semblance of security in our lives.
Maybe you could unpack that. What should we be doing better?
You know, there are all of these Republicans and a lot of folks that are chomping at the bit to reopen the economy. And you look at what's happening in Georgia, and you have Governor Kemp who reopened the economy.
This measure will apply statewide and will be the operational standard in all jurisdictions.
But who pays the price? Whose life gets put on the chopping block? It's not the governor's. He reopens the state and keeps the governor's mansion closed for tours. The only people that really get put at risk for that, the people whose lives that you are going to sacrifice, are people who work at Target and bus drivers and domestic workers. The people who are getting sick are Black. The people who are getting sick are brown. They're middle class, working class, they're poor, they're just normal people. And the way that we prevent this from ever happening again is making sure that workers have access to health care, that people are finally paid enough to live, that we have real deal worker protections and a labor movement with power in the United States. And for all of these things, I am called a communist and more. But the fact of the matter is, we cannot go back to killing people. We were killing people before this crisis. 70-hour work weeks, working multiple jobs with kids on $10 an hour kills you. We cannot afford it on a moral level. It is inhumane. It is barbaric. Even if you're just this heartless human being that only thinks of working people as just mules to move your product, it'll mess up your supply chain. So how's that for a capitalist argument?
The opening up of, quote unquote, opening up of America's economy, it's become highly controversial, and it seems to go in the face of science. And the scientists are saying it's much too early, but states are opening up saying the economy is more important. What is the mood in Washington for opening up versus not opening up? And is that, again, another partisan issue?
People in Washington know, I think even Republicans know, that opening up is the wrong thing to do. The difference is that you have someone like Governor Kemp or DeSantis in Florida. These are the folks that actually issue the stay-at-home order or don't issue it. And so they feel the political pressure.
We have to open our country again.
You have Trump that's tweeting and talking about reopen the economy. And of course, he says jump, and Kemp says how high. And so Kemp immediately barrels forward, doesn't tell anyone, just kind of impulsively issues this reopening, and then Trump backs away from it after it's widely panned.
I told the governor very simply that I disagree with his decision, but he has to do what he thinks is right.
There are a fair degree of Republicans that actually know what the right thing is to do in terms of saving lives, but then they are also very politically incentivized to not do that. You know, I think what we're seeing right now is Mnuchin has indicated that he is done helping small businesses. McConnell is starting to indicate that he is done, because now, after passing a $2 trillion tax cut, 2 years ago, after record levels of corruption and giveaways, and now that Wall Street got its bag, now Mitch McConnell, the moment we start talking about healthcare and living wages and protections for everyday people, Mitch McConnell is now all of a sudden worried about the national debt. The thing about scientific crises, whether it's coronavirus, whether it's climate change, is that they happen no matter what. And so there's a certain force of nature aspect that I think they have to contend with that they have not had to contend with in a large degree of other issues.
Do you think that income inequality gets worse during this pandemic? Because we've seen a lot of stats that the billionaires are getting richer and poor people are getting poorer. What happens in the future with, income inequality with communities that you represent?
This is absolutely going to make income inequality worse. There is no question. And it did not have to be this way. This crisis could have ushered in an era of public policy that really healed, and it continues to be an opportunity to usher in an era of public policy that really aims and heals at a lot of the things that got us here. But we aren't doing that. What we are doing is that we are kind of responding to a fire instead of with water. We are responding to it with gasoline. You look at our bailout package, we're giving far more to Wall Street and we're giving far less, if anything at all, in many cases, nothing to small businesses. When you pump Wall Street with $4 trillion and you give small businesses these tiny PPP loans that most of them can't even get, that are going to like the Lakers instead of your local coffee shop, is that you now have given Wall Street huge power to consolidate industries in the economy and to buy up all of these smaller businesses. And you've basically set the stage for oligopolies across the board in many industries. So that's how Congress responded.
The bill as amended is passed.
You've got stock prices that are taking a hit, but that's, the kind of big fleecing that lobbyists have done in our politics is interchange the stock market with the economy and basically convince people that the health and stock prices is the same thing as a jobs report or any other qualitative indicator of our economy. Coronavirus presents an opportunity for the United States to actually catch up with the developed world, with the rest of the developed world, in healthcare guarantees, in wages, in jobs. It's an opportunity for us to actually confront racial inequity in the United States that so many people refuse and don't want to talk about. But it is being squandered. When the stay-at-home orders were first issued, we saw a massive shift in the direction of progressive policy. You had Mitt Romney talking about a universal basic income. You had Republicans talking about UBI, talking about free healthcare. You had Republicans talking about this, just forced up against the wall to confront reality. They said, this is what we have to do. And then a couple of interesting things happened. It felt like once the racial data came out that showed that this was disproportionately impacting working class people and Black and brown people, it was almost like within days, a lot of those ambitions just fell. But when we didn't know who it was going to impact, when all of us felt vulnerable, we were ready to change. But when we started to see that this was impacting vulnerable people more, and that more affluent people and more of the privileged were kind of shielded in a way, we're almost kind of dragging back to business as usual. And I think that at the very least should be a moment of reflection for our country.
And what do you think happens in this election year of 2020?
No, I think anything can happen. I think there's this nostalgia for the bipartisan 90s a lot.
The Republicans and the Democrats all pulled together and passed the biggest bill in history in record time.
There's just this huge desire, I think, among more tenured Democrats in Washington for a bipartisan bill. And so, you know what? Let's scrap the living wage. Let's scrap protections for immigrants. Let's scrap checks to Puerto Rico. Let's scrap treating Puerto Ricans like the rest of the United States, the rest of any other American, because we need a bipartisan bill. And we need something that Republicans can get on board with, and completely, not even brokered, right? Because there are so many bills that we pass where we are happy losing 50 Democrats and we're happy losing 50 Republicans. But no, this bill needed to be almost unanimous between both parties. What that has done is cost lives. It's cost my district lives. What I would wish in terms of November is for us to actually call a spade and be uncompromising in saying that Republicans are the ones who fought for a $4 trillion corporate slush fund bailout. Republicans are the ones that are fighting against mass testing capacity in the United States. Republicans are the ones who don't want to fund hospitals. But we don't want to say those things because we just want to be bipartisan. That ship has sailed. America has fundamentally changed, and we are not getting that back. We are in a different world with new challenges that we have to contend with, and the old playbooks are not the same. By continuing to reach for them, we will continue to let people die.
So the old playbooks are not the same. I think, you talk about, let's say, millennials who are just getting back on their feet after the 2008 recession. You have, Gen Z coming of age. What do you say to them? What do you say to this large, disaffected, disenfranchised group?
We've had it, right? It's, and I think the thing that I would say is to organize outside of electoral politics. Maybe that's an unusual thing for an elected official to say, but one thing that I do want to say is that electoral politics is not enough. We need to be in electoral politics, but we cannot rely on elected officials to save us either.
Who does save us?
Ourselves. We need to unionize our workplaces, and we need to talk about rent strikes. We need to discuss and create bailout funds to save people's lives and get them out of Rikers. We need to talk about mutual aid, and we need to develop mutual aid networks in our neighborhoods and in our communities. We need to create the conditions for recreating our lives, and that requires multiple pieces. It requires electoral organizing. It requires labor organizing. It requires racial justice organizing, gender organizing. It requires all of these things. The thing that can make things better is by us expanding our organizing. And we've already started. This is only growing. When I graduated college, that's when Occupy Wall Street happened. And it changed everything for millennials. And people talk about it as like this kind of flash in the pan, one and done thing. It was not. It was fertilizer. It was the first time that we started to actually see our conditions being politically articulated in the streets. The first big election after that whole cycle of Occupy was Bernie Sanders in 2016. And we saw an unprecedented shift.
You are the revolutionaries.
That kind of tectonic shift in our politics is generational, and it is a result of us taking a multi-pronged approach to organizing that, yes, includes electoral politics, but it is not limited by it.
Is social revolution, like Occupy Wall Street, our only hope to have comprehensive change?
Well, I think it's certainly necessary, and what does social revolution mean to a different person? Some people hear social revolution and they're like, oh my God, the streets are on fire, you're calling for violence, like all of these things. It doesn't mean like setting stuff on fire. It means unionizing your workplace. It means not being afraid to go on strike. The answer to the question is yes. It requires social revolution for us to have a moral economy.
When I interviewed President Obama at the last of his tenure, and I said, what worries you the most after your presidency? And he said, what I'm worried most about is it seems that the institutions of our democracy are under siege and that they seem to be one by one being dismantled.
What worries me is whether the institutions that we've built are going to be adapted fast enough to meet the challenges that we face.
it seems to be his fears are being brought to fruition. My last question is, can Biden be that consensus politician? Can he be the candidate that unites the country?
So the first question, I think, I agree with President Obama. I think our institutions of democracy are absolutely under siege at every single level. Our voter laws are horrendous. You have the Senate, which is undemocratic in nature, in that it overrepresents smaller populations of people. You also have just money in politics, where it is, where we live in a country where corporations are treated as sacred as human beings. And that really says something. They have rights, and they have, and dollars are counted as speech. And that has massively distorted our political landscape. You have media. You have the consolidation of media into a handful of oligarchical families, even. You look at the Murdochs. And so many media outlets, Fox News is, it is a bullhorn for billionaires. And they have gotten the manipulation of people down to a science. So all of these things, and then not to mention just our economy is being consolidated into further monopolization. And so there's a very powerful restructuring, and we are moving away from democracy in the United States. We're moving towards authoritarianism. If the question is, can Biden win? I think Biden has the potential to win a general election. Whether he can offer deeper structural changes that get us to a healthier place, I don't necessarily know if he's going to move us forward, but I think people can see him as stopping the bleeding.
And do you endorse him?
I personally draw a distinction between endorsing a candidate and voting for them. I have not yet endorsed Vice President Biden, but I will be voting for him in November.
Representative Ocasio-Cortez, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.